Maybe if you were more like your sister. Mom sighed, glowing about her new job as if the sentence were a compliment she'd practiced. It wasn't said loudly. It didn't need to be. The words settled on the tablecloth, slid between the glasses, and found their place. Someone nodded. Someone smiled. The approval was quiet and complete. I noticed the small things first. Ice melting into water, a fork resting on china, the piano in the corner moving through a slow piece it had played before. Laughter arrived on cue, light and brief, the kind meant to smooth over edges. I didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. The statement had already been filed. My seat was not with the family. It was a side table near the service door, angled just enough that I could see the room without being seen. Each time the door opened, it made a soft sound, then closed again. White flowers ran low along the tables, trimmed so people could talk across them without obstruction. The lighting was warm, forgiving. It made everything look intentional. My mother continued. She spoke in measured phrases, sensible choices, proper paths, mornings that start on time, work that looks right from the outside. The language was tidy. It didn't accuse. It summarized. Heads turned toward her. No one interrupted. No one asked a question. I took a sip of water. Lemon. I set the glass down and aligned it with the edge of the table. The napkin in my lap had a crease I smoothed once. Across the room, a server paused with a tray, waiting for a signal that didn't come. The piano shifted keys. The room stayed calm. When the laughter faded, conversation resumed as if nothing had happened. That's how these things work. A remark is made, it lands. Life moves forward. I stayed where I was, hands still, eyes open. I marked the phrasing and the time. I noted the witnesses. I've learned to do that. Words matter later when they're repeated back exactly as spoken. Someone leaned over to refill a glass. A chair scraped, then settled. I watched faces turn toward the center table, toward the version of success everyone understood. I did not look down at my phone. I did not explain. Explaining invites debate. Debate suggests uncertainty. Silence used correctly does not argue. It records. I had already learned that reacting in the moment only strengthens the story being told about you. Waiting lets the record speak for itself. So I waited. I let the room continue. I let the music play. I let the service door open and close. They didn't know what would surface before dessert. If you've ever been quietly judged by the people you loved, most stay with me. The room moved on the way it always does. Plates were cleared, glasses refilled, conversations found safer ground. I stayed where I was and watched the order reassert itself. It didn't need instructions. Everyone knew where to look. Catherine sat at the center table. She always did. Her posture was straight. Her smile practiced her presence, easy to read. She wore a dress that fit the room and a watch that caught the light when she lifted her hand. Someone mentioned her office. Someone else mentioned her cases. The words partner track floated by, then settled. Heads nodded. This was familiar terrain. My parents spoke about her life in a way that sounded like inventory. Law degree, firm name, house with a porch, commute that made sense. Mornings that began and ended on schedule. It wasn't praise exactly. It was confirmation. A checklist being read aloud to make sure nothing had changed. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Interrupting suggests a competing version. There wasn't one being requested. When my name came up, it did so briefly. A pause, a qualifier. The tone shifted to careful. She freelances, she works from home, she's still figuring things out. The phrases were delivered lightly, the way people describe a temporary condition they expect to resolve on its own. No one asked what I worked on. No one asked who I worked with. The details weren't necessary. The category had already been assigned. A cousin leaned over and said it must be nice to have flexibility. An aunt added that not everyone is built for pressure. A neighbor nodded and said at least I had time. The comments stacked neatly, each one reinforcing the last. I acknowledged them with a small smile. I thanked them. I did not correct the record. Catherine excused herself to greet someone new. The room followed her movement with its eyes. That too was automatic. She carried herself like someone whose choices had been validated enough times to become permanent. I noted the way my parents watched her, not anxiously, but with relief. She was proof. She made the rest easier to explain. I took another sip of water. The glass was empty now. I turned it upside down on the coaster and left it there. A server passed and glanced at it, then at me, waiting for a signal. I shook my head once. He moved on. There's a comfort people take in clear labels. Lawyer, homeowner, responsible. They require no follow-up. They don't invite questions that could complicate the story. What doesn't fit gets reduced to something harmless. Freelancer, working from home, still figuring it out. Phrases that suggest motion without direction. I had learned over time that offering specifics only widened the gap. Numbers raised eyebrows, names were misheard, outcomes were reframed as luck. It was easier to let the shorthand stand, easier to let silence do its work. The piano continued. A server announced dessert options. Laughter rose again, softer, now settling into the evening. The order held. Catherine was the example. I was the footnote. That was the understanding. I stayed seated. I watched. I waited. By the time dessert was announced, the roles were fixed. The room had settled into its understanding of who carried weight and who required patience. I had seen this before. Not just here. Everywhere my name was spoken without me in the room. They thought I did small things, short projects, temporary work, tasks that filled time rather than built anything. When asked, my mother would say I helped people online. My father would add that I was creative in the way people use that word when they mean uncertain. No one corrected them. I didn't either. They thought my income fluctuated, that I checked my balance often, that I lived carefully, that my plans were provisional. It showed in the way they spoke to me. Offers came wrapped as concern. Questions arrived softened. Did I need help? Was I managing? Had I thought about something more stable? They thought I needed to be looked after, that someone should keep an eye on me, that a proper job would eventually appear if I stayed patient. Their tone wasn't cruel. It didn't need to be. It was settled. Assumptions age quickly when no one challenges them. I had learned not to fill the silence with explanations. Explanations invite evaluation. Evaluation invites correction. I stopped providing details after I realized they were never written down. What mattered was the label, not the content. Freelancer, working from home, still figuring things out. Once those words were in place, the rest was decorative. At holidays, someone would ask what I was up to now. I would answer with a sentence. It was always the wrong one. Too vague and they'd smile politely. Too specific and they'd glance away. Numbers made them uncomfortable. Names meant nothing to them unless they recognized them. Outcomes were treated as exceptions. So I shortened my answers. I learned to nod. I learned to let conversations end themselves. There is a point where clarity stops helping. After that, it only widens the gap between what is said and what is believed. They spoke about me as if I weren't present even when I was. Not unkindly, just confidently. The way people discuss a known quantity. My life was framed as an interim state, a phase, something that would resolve once I made better choices or accepted guidance. I watched how they spoke about Catherine and then about me. The contrast was clean. Her achievements were facts. Mine were possibilities. Her path was stable. Mine was temporary. The difference was not in volume or tone. It was in certainty. I didn't correct them because there was nothing to correct. They weren't missing information. They were missing curiosity. That is harder to supply. There were moments when I could have said more. I remember standing in a kitchen 2 years ago, my phone lighting up with a message that required an answer. I turned it face down before anyone noticed. Someone was asking if I had considered applying somewhere reputable. I said I was fine. It was the truth as far as it went. Over time, I realized they had already decided who I was. Once a decision like that is made, additional data becomes noise. It gets filtered out, reframed, dismissed. So I stopped offering it. I let the version of me they preferred sit where it was placed. I let them believe what made sense to them. Silence became a kind of record, not of what I lacked, but of what they never asked to see. That understanding stayed with me as the plates were cleared and the forks rested. Nothing had shifted yet. It didn't need to. The story they told about me was complete. They were comfortable with it, for now. There had been other tables before this one, other rooms, other seasons where the same conclusions were reached without discussion. I recognized the pattern as the plates were cleared. It always began the same way, someone asking politely what I was working on now. Thanksgiving was the usual setting. The kitchen warmed, the counters crowded, the television low in the background. I would stand near the sink with a glass in my hand and say it plainly. My work is growing. I didn't embellish. I didn't name numbers. I didn't lead with outcomes. Just a statement of direction. The response was predictable. A nod. A pause. Then a shift. Someone would ask if the turkey was ready. Someone else would mention a neighbor's promotion. The conversation moved as if my sentence had been a draft that didn't make the final cut. Another year I tried again. Same holiday, same phrasing. My work is growing. My father suggested I think about benefits. My mother asked if I'd seen the posting at a firm she trusted. The advice arrived quickly, already prepared. No follow-up questions, no request for detail. I learned to notice the mechanics of it. The way eye contact broke after I spoke. The way concern replaced curiosity. The way my statement was treated as optimism rather than information. They weren't challenging me. They were redirecting me. Once I mentioned a deadline that mattered. I said I'd be traveling the following week. My aunt smiled and said it must be nice to have freedom. Someone else joked about pajamas and laptops. The room laughed lightly. I did not correct them. I washed my glass and set it in the rack. The suggestion of a real job surfaced often. It was never framed as pressure, always as support. Something steady, something with a name they recognized. I listened. I thanked them. I did not explain that what I was doing already required contracts, schedules, and signatures. That explanation had been offered before. It hadn't landed. They heard the words. That wasn't the problem. They just didn't assign weight to them. Growth to them was something that happened inside structures they understood. Anything outside that looked provisional by default. I adjusted. I shortened sentences. I avoided specifics. I learned which details triggered advice and which ones passed without comment. Silence became a form of maintenance. It kept gatherings intact. It kept me from being managed. Over time, I realized belief was the missing step. Not information, not proof. Belief. Without it, every statement I made became hypothetical. Something to be monitored, not acknowledged. There were moments I considered pressing harder, laying out facts, naming outcomes. But facts, when offered to someone who has already decided, feel like a challenge. And challenges change the tone of a room. I wasn't interested in that, so I stopped trying to explain. I let my words remain simple and my actions remain unseen. The past was full of attempts that had been quietly set aside, not because they were unclear, because they didn't fit. By the time the plates were cleared that evening, nothing about that had changed. The history of being unheard was already written. It sat between us, unspoken, complete. The past stayed where it belonged, quiet, finished. It had taught me when to stop speaking and when to observe. That habit carried me into the present without effort. It was subtle at first, a shift so small it could have been dismissed. A phone screen lighting up at the far end of the room, then another, no sound yet, just light appearing where it hadn't been a moment before. Someone glanced down, frowned slightly, then looked up again as if checking whether they were alone in noticing it. Conversation thinned, not stopped, just loosened. Words came slower, laughter shortened. A man near the center table angled his phone toward his wife. She leaned in. Her smile didn't return. I stayed still. I kept my eyes forward. The piano continued its set, steady and unaware. Servers moved between tables with practiced timing. Plates for dessert were being staged near the kitchen. The evening was proceeding as planned. Another screen lit up. This time closer. A cousin checked her phone twice, then set it face down. Someone across from her picked theirs up immediately after, thumb hovering, then scrolling. Their expression changed. Not surprise, recognition. I felt the vibration before I looked. One short pulse against the table where my phone rested. I didn't reach for it right away. I finished my sip of water first. Lemon again. The glass was half full now. I set it down and only then glanced at the screen. A single message. No punctuation, no commentary, just confirmation. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into place. I did not look around to see who had noticed. I did not check the time. There was nothing to manage. The whispers started then. Low, controlled. The kind meant to stay contained. Someone asked quietly if it was real. Someone else nodded without answering. A phone was passed hand to hand, angled carefully. A breath was taken in and not released. I noticed how quickly attention moved away from the head table. How eyes shifted, then returned, then shifted again. The center of the room was no longer fixed. It was searching. Catherine was laughing with someone near the cake. She hadn't noticed yet. My parents were mid-conversation, heads close together, their posture unchanged. They were still operating inside the version of the evening they expected. A server approached my table and asked if I wanted dessert now or later. I said later. He nodded and moved on. His badge caught the light briefly, then disappeared. Phones continued to glow. More people stopped pretending they hadn't seen. The piano reached the end of a piece and paused. For a moment, there was no music, just the sound of movement and breath. Then the next song began. No one spoke to me, not yet. That too was telling. Information was being processed. The room was recalibrating. I stayed seated, hands still, back straight. I did not smile. I did not prepare a response. This wasn't my moment to explain anything. Explanation would interrupt what was happening. What was happening didn't need my help. I watched the quiet spread. Watched certainty loosen. Watched the assumptions I had lived inside for years begin to strain under their own weight. I took another sip of water. The room was already leaning when she approached, not toward me, toward the idea that something had moved without permission. She didn't hurry, she didn't scan faces. She walked with purpose, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you're looking for. Mid-50s, maybe older, neutral dress, no jewelry that caught the light. She stopped at my table and waited until I looked up. Margaret Hale. She said it clearly, not as a guess, as a checkmark. I answered with a nod. I didn't stand. I didn't offer my hand. There was no need. She had already confirmed what she came to confirm. I'm Helen Moore, she said, financial desk. She kept her voice low. Professional. Contained. She angled her body so the conversation stayed narrow, but it was too late for that. Names travel. Tone travels faster. My parents turned at the sound of my name. Not quickly, not slowly, together. The way people do when something unexpected interrupts a familiar sequence. Their faces held the same expression I'd seen before, usually reserved for strangers who shared our last name. Helen glanced past me once, just long enough to understand the room. She'd read rooms like this before. She knew when to proceed and when to wait. Do you have a moment? She asked. I do, I said. That was it. No explanation, no qualifiers. A phone slipped from someone's hand at the center table and was caught just in time. A chair shifted. The piano kept playing, but the notes felt farther apart now. The air had changed texture. Helen placed a folder on the table between us. Plain, no logo. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Its presence was enough. I wanted to introduce myself in person, she said. The piece went live earlier than expected. I nodded again. I had already seen the timestamp. Behind her, people were no longer pretending to talk. They were watching. Carefully. Quietly. The way people watch when they sense a recalibration they don't yet understand. My mother stood, just slightly, as if unsure whether to sit or move closer. My father followed a second later. They didn't interrupt. They didn't ask. They waited for context. Helen turned toward them, then just enough to include them without shifting control. I'm with Forbes, she said. We've been covering your daughter's work for some time. She didn't say my accomplishments. She didn't say numbers. She didn't use adjectives. She stated affiliation. That was enough. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, the kind that happens when new information enters a closed system and everything pauses to reprocess. My father looked at me, then at Helen, then back at me again. His mouth opened, closed. He asked one question. Is this accurate? Yes, I said. No emphasis, no defense. Helen slid the folder an inch closer to me. We'll need a comment later, she said. There's interest. I understand, I said. That was the end of our exchange. She nodded once, stepped back, and let the room do what it needed to do. She didn't linger. She didn't watch reactions. She had delivered the fact. The rest wasn't her job. Phones came out openly now. Screens turned, pages loaded. No one spoke loudly. No one laughed. The assumptions that had held the evening together began to loosen quietly without argument. I stayed seated. I didn't look toward the center table. I didn't correct anyone's posture or reach for a microphone. I let the confirmation stand where it had been placed. The room was no longer arranged the way it had been 10 minutes earlier, and I hadn't said anything to make it so. The confirmation didn't arrive as an announcement. It arrived as procedure. Helen stayed where she was for a moment longer, long enough for the first wave of disbelief to pass. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform. She spoke the way people do when accuracy matters more than reaction. She outlined the company the same way my parents once outlined Catherine's career. Founded date, scope, current valuation, markets. The words were clean, measured, each one placed where it belonged. She mentioned the article by name, then the time it went live. She referenced sources already linked, public records, filings, third-party verification, nothing personal, nothing emotional. Phones moved again, faster now, pages refreshed. Someone whispered a number and stopped halfway through the sentence as if saying it out loud might change it. A man near the cake leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, then uncrossed them. He didn't know what to do with his hands. I didn't fill the space. There was no need. Filling space implies persuasion. This wasn't persuasion. It was disclosure. My father asked his question again, quieter this time. Is this true? I nodded once. That was all. Helen didn't look at me when she continued. She addressed the room without addressing it directly. She spoke about timelines, about growth patterns, about recognition outside the family circle, about why the piece mattered now, not because of the event, because of the numbers. No one interrupted her. No one corrected her. No one laughed. My mother's phone slipped from her fingers and landed face up on the table. She didn't reach for it right away. She stared at the screen as if it had changed languages. Catherine had stopped smiling. She was still standing near the cake, one hand resting on the table for balance. Someone said her name softly. She didn't answer. The piano finished its piece and didn't start another. No one noticed. The silence wasn't dramatic. It was logistical. A system pausing to adjust. Helen closed the folder she had brought and slid it back into her bag. We'll follow up later, she said to me. There's interest from several outlets. I understand, I said. That was the extent of our exchange. She nodded once more and stepped away. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She didn't stay to observe the aftermath. She had delivered what she came to deliver. The rest belonged to the room. What followed was quiet recalibration. People who had spoken freely minutes earlier now measured their words. Conversations restarted at lower volumes. Eyes moved toward me, then away, then back again. Not curiosity. Assessment. Someone asked my father if he'd seen the article. He didn't answer. He was still reading. My mother finally picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen, then stopped. She set it down again. No one asked me how long it had been true. No one asked why they hadn't known. Those questions came later. This moment wasn't for questions. It was for recognition. I stayed seated. I didn't change my posture. I didn't look for anyone's reaction. I had learned a long time ago that reactions are temporary. Records are not. The version of me that had been discussed earlier in the evening no longer fit the information now circulating. That mismatch produced silence. Not anger, not applause. Silence. I didn't announce anything. I didn't have to. The truth had entered the room without my help, and it stood on its own. The room didn't recover. It reorganized. People returned to their seats, but not their earlier ease. Plates sat untouched. Dessert arrived and cooled. Conversations resumed in fragments, then stalled again. What had been revealed was now being absorbed piece by people recalculating what they thought they knew. My mother picked up her phone at last, both hands this time. Her thumb scrolled too quickly, then stopped. She adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to the screen. The light reflected back onto her face, pale and steady. She read without speaking. When she reached the end, she went back to the beginning and read it again. Her hands shook just enough to be noticeable. My father stood beside her. He didn't touch the phone. He watched her read. He had always trusted summaries. This time he waited for the full text. Around us, the room kept its distance. People pretended to talk about weather travel schedules. No one raised a voice. No one laughed. The silence was layered now, reinforced by restraint. My father cleared his throat once. It didn't help. He tried again. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked. The question was not angry. It wasn't accusing. It sounded procedural, as if the correct sequence had been skipped and he needed to know where the error occurred. I looked at him, then at my mother, then back at the table. The answer didn't require rehearsal. "I did," I said. "You just didn't hear it, that was all. I didn't list dates. I didn't remind them of kitchens and holidays and sentences spoken and set aside. I didn't reference conversations that had been redirected or advice that had been offered instead of questions. I let the statement stand on its own." My mother lowered the phone. She didn't argue. She didn't deny it. She searched her memory visibly, as if scanning for a moment she could contest. Nothing came up. "I thought you were managing," she said finally. I said. My father nodded once. Not in agreement, in recognition. He sat down slowly, the way people do when something has shifted and their balance needs time to catch up. Someone nearby asked if everything was all right. My mother said yes. Her voice was steady now. The question passed. The late questions continued in smaller forms. How long had it been like this? Why now? Who else knew? Each one came with an assumption attached, and I answered only what was asked. I did not fill gaps. Gaps invite speculation. I noticed how the tone had changed. Earlier advice had been offered freely. Now questions arrived carefully, each one waiting to see whether it was permitted. The authority in the room had moved without ceremony. Catherine approached but stopped a few steps away. She didn't speak. She looked at me as if seeing a version she hadn't known how to place. I met her eyes. I didn't explain. She nodded once and stepped back. My parents stayed quiet. They reread the article. They checked sources. They compared details. This was how they processed things they couldn't dismiss. Through confirmation. Through repetition. No one asked me how it felt. That question belonged to another version of the evening. I remained where I was. Seated. Still. The truth had already done what explanations never could. It hadn't argued. It hadn't asked permission. It had arrived fully formed and taken its place. The questions came late. They always do. The questions slowed, then stopped. Not because they were answered, but because they reached a limit. There is a point where curiosity gives way to reckoning. The room had crossed it. I didn't take the silence as an opening. I didn't fill it with reassurance or explanation. I had learned that clarity offered too early gets reshaped into comfort for the listener. That wasn't my task. This wasn't about proving anything I said when it became clear that something needed to be said. My voice stayed level. I didn't raise it. I didn't lower it either. I didn't hide what I was doing to gain leverage. I didn't wait for a reveal. I simply stopped translating my life into a language that required approval. There is a difference. One is strategy. The other is survival. I looked at my parents while I spoke, but I wasn't appealing to them. I was stating terms, not defensively, not as an ultimatum, as a fact that had already shaped my choices. I learned how to function without being believed, I said. That was the adjustment. No one interrupted. No one disagreed. The sentence didn't invite response. It closed a loop. I didn't blame them. Blame implies expectation. I had let that go years ago. I had stopped waiting for curiosity that never arrived, stopped framing my life in ways meant to earn nods, stopped correcting assumptions that had hardened into habit. What I did next was simpler. I want to be respected, I said, and I want to be listened to, not admired, not praised, not apologized to. Just those two things. Respect changes behavior. Listening changes outcomes. Everything else is optional. My father nodded slowly, not reflexively, deliberately. My mother didn't speak. She folded her hands and kept them there. Catherine looked between us, then down at the floor. No one rushed to respond. That was fine. I wasn't asking for reconciliation. I wasn't closing a wound. I was drawing a line. I stayed seated. I didn't stand to emphasize anything. Standing would have shifted the dynamic back toward performance. I wasn't performing. A server passed by and asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes. When it arrived, I didn't drink it right away. I let it sit. Steam rose, then thinned. The cup warmed my hands. The moment didn't need punctuation. Around us, the evening continued at a distance. People spoke again cautiously. The event resumed in pieces. It would never be what it had been earlier. That version was finished. I noticed something else then. No one offered advice anymore. No one suggested alternatives. No one framed my choices as temporary. The tone had shifted from management to observation. That mattered. I wasn't reclaiming anything. I had already built my life without their endorsement. What I was doing now was protecting it. I'm not asking you to change your view of success, I said, only to stop assuming mine is provisional. That was the boundary. Clear, quiet, enforceable. They didn't argue, they didn't defend themselves, they didn't rush to agree. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one. It wasn't shock. It was acceptance beginning to form. I finished my coffee. It had gone cool. I set the cup down and aligned it with the edge of the table the same way I had earlier with the glass. Nothing dramatic followed. There didn't need to be. The work of that moment wasn't to win. It was to stop explaining. The evening wound down without ceremony. Chairs were pushed in, coats were collected. People said goodbyes that sounded careful, as if volume alone could reopen something no one wanted to touch again. I stayed seated until the room thinned. There was no reason to hurry. My parents approached together, not urgently, not tentatively either. They stood at a respectful distance, waiting to see if this was a moment that required permission. "We should talk," my mother said. "Not now, not here. Just a statement placed between us." I know I said. That was all I offered. I didn't suggest a time. I didn't ask questions. Some conversations don't need to be scheduled to exist. Others need space before they're safe. My father nodded. He didn't press. That mattered. Outside, the night air was cooler than the room had been. The sound changed when the doors closed behind me. Fewer voices, fewer expectations. The street was quiet. I stood there for a moment, keys in hand, listening to nothing in particular. In the days that followed, messages came in measured tones, invitations framed as openness, apologies shaped like explanations. I read them when I had time. I didn't respond right away. Being seen, I realized, does not undo the years of being overlooked. Recognition doesn't rewrite habits. It doesn't restore moments that passed without witness. It doesn't fill in the quiet where curiosity should have been. What it does is clarify choices. I didn't rush back into the roles that had once been assigned to me. I didn't step forward to reassure anyone that things were fine. Fine had never been the issue. Assumptions were. I thought about the version of myself that used to arrive early and leave late, adjusting language, editing details, smoothing edges to make things easier for other people. That version had done her job. She had kept the peace when peace was the priority. This was different. The space I'd built didn't require translation. It didn't ask for belief. It functioned whether anyone approved of it or not. That was the difference I was protecting now. When I pictured sitting down with them again, I didn't imagine confrontation. I imagined silence, the kind that waits to see what fills it. The kind that reveals whether listening has actually begun. I wasn't closing a door. I was deciding how wide it could open. That night had changed the terms, not the past. It hadn't given me anything new. It had confirmed what I already knew. I could stand where I was without permission. I could leave without explanation. I could choose when and how to re-enter a conversation that once defined me without my consent. Being seen doesn't erase the years of being invisible. It simply gives you the option to stop pretending those years didn't shape you. If you were in my place, would you go back? Or would you protect the peace you finally built?